Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. And today, I wanted to start off the episode in discussing about misinformation. And especially here, where I'm at in the West, the United States, there is a lot of information that arises that is simply not true, and then it is founded to be completely untrue, and then it just kind of goes away. There's not a lot of discussion about the prior reporting on that untruth. It just disappears. And then you, the viewer, will need to do your own due diligence to try and find out what exactly transpired in terms of the initial story and why it changed. A great example of that would be the ghost of Kiev. Do you remember the ghost of Kiev? Now you pronounce it, by the way, instead of Kiev, you say Kiev. For decades, we pronounced Kiev, Kiev. Now, with the onset of this war, suddenly Western media demands that you pronounce it Kiev. I still pronounce it Kiev. And I do enjoy chicken Kiev as well. And I don't call chicken Kiev chicken Kiev. Hence my point. So again, the ghost of Kiev. And this was talked about for some time. As a matter of fact, my children had mentioned the ghost of Kiev. They had talked about this Ukrainian fighter pilot that was shooting down all these Russian fighter planes over Kiev. Not true. Never happened, never existed. In fact, one of the reports that was said to be the ghost of Kiev shooting down a Russian aircraft over Kiev was in fact a shoot down of a Ukrainian Su-27 over Kiev by either Russian long-range ground-to-air missiles or air-to-air missiles from an aircraft, or an S-400 possibly. Or it was the possibility that the Ukrainians had shot down its own aircraft. So again, misinformation. Another classic misinformation campaign was while the initial airborne operation to seize control of Hostomel was taking place to the northwest of Kiev, we had received reports that there was a Russian airborne operation taking place within the vicinity of Vishniev. In this area here, there's another air base just south of Kiev, and I believe that is it right there. It's just on the outskirts of Vishniev. And there was an alleged battle that took place. There was airborne forces that were landing just to the southwest of Kiev. The Ukrainians then reported that they had shot down two Russian transport aircraft with about 100 paratroopers on board each of these aircraft. So there have been the death of up to 200 Russian paratroopers. Now the problem with this is it never happened. It didn't occur. We don't even believe there was a Russian operation that even took place southwest of Kiev near Vishniev at this airbase. Never happened, never occurred. Now, the Ukrainians have since corrected this airborne operations and claims that it was Russian sleeper cells that had gone into action near Vishniev at this airbase. Now, what we believe quite possibly occurred is that there may have been Russian FSB or Spetsnaz forces operating southwest of Kiev. It's possible. We just don't know at this point. But we think that what occurred is elements of the Ukrainian National Guard, security force units, such as this unit right here, the 25th Public Protection Brigade of the National Guard, quite possibly ended up fighting Ukrainian units. Again, this is the fog of war. There are reports of an airborne operation underway southwest of Kiev. There are reports of Russian sleeper cells being activated southwest of Kiev. We know that there is a vicious battle taking place northwest of Kiev near Hostomel, but we don't know what's happening to the southwest. So in all likelihood, you had Ukrainian National Guard units moving towards the scene of an alleged Russian airborne operation. You have additional Ukrainian units such as the 112th Territorial Brigade. You have other units, other territorial militia type units in Kiev. You have Ukrainian ground force units that were converging on this airbase. In all likelihood, the Ukrainians probably started fighting Ukrainians. You were seeing Ukrainian National Guard units probably engaged against its own forces because of the fog of war. But again, this is the kind of misinformation that we've seen very prevalent in this conflict, and now leading up to where we are now, today. We have been hearing about this very large Ukrainian counteroffensive that was going to take place. Now, indeed, the Ukrainians have launched successful offensive operations, counteroffensive operations against Russian forces. We have seen a successful Ukrainian operation near Kharkov, taking back a tremendous amount of territory that the Russians had previously seized. I believe that Kharkov was, and has been a primary goal of the Russian Federation to take control over. I could not envision that post-Ukraine-Russian war that the Russians would walk away from this conflict without seizing Kharkov. Again, a very key target, I believe, in this war. And the Ukrainians have been very successful in its operation to continue to hold on to Kharkov and take territory in these areas that the Russians once occupied or had taken control over. Now, we also know that in the southwest, near Kherson, on the western bank of the Dnieper River, that while the Russians gave up its positions on the western bank of the Dnieper River to include Kherson, the city, the Russians conducted a tactical withdrawal. So again, this was something that the Russians chose to do, chose to redeploy its forces to areas that it could see itself holding on to, rather than continuing to try and hold on this western bank of the Dnieper River with the 1 to 2 crossing routes to support its forces. So it's probably a common sense operation by the Russians to withdraw from Kherson, but the operation that took place near Kharkov, again, that was you would have to admit, a resounding Ukrainian win. Now we're talking about this new offensive that could take place, and we were hearing that it's imminent. It could be within weeks, that it could be directed against the Donbass. It could be directed against breaking the encirclement of Bakhmut. It could be a drive. The most optimistic information we were getting out of Kiev was that this large Ukrainian offensive was going to be directed towards Melitopol, to sever the land corridor, take control of Melitopol. Again, obviously multiple road junctions here at Melitopol as well. Now the Ukrainians are taking a step back, and what we're hearing is, in fact, that the capability to conduct a large-scale offensive operation is probably not going to happen, because that capability does not exist right now for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians spent a lot of equipment, a lot of lives, a lot of effort in its Kharkov offensive. It also expended a lot of lives and a lot of equipment northeast of Kherson in this area as well, as they moved south along the Dnieper River towards Kherson in these offensive operations that took place in this area. The Ukrainians took significant casualties, very large casualties, as did they take casualties in the Kharkov operation as well. Again, media reports indicate that this was some sort of Ukrainian blitzkrieg, pardon the pun, that drove Russian forces out. Now, was it just successful? Yes, absolutely it was. But was it not costly for the Ukrainians? It was absolutely costly, very costly. Hence, where we're kind of sitting right now. They lost a lot of equipment, the Ukrainians, in these operations near Kharkov and then to the northeast of Kherson as well. And that's kind of what has led now to this static war that we're continuing to see all along the front line. Now, obviously, as summer approaches, we here at MFAN fully expect that the Russians are going to launch larger operations in the summer. Again, what is happening inside of Russia right now, in the lack of high-tempo maneuver operations that we have simply not seen in quite a few months, quite frankly. We expect we will see those operations in the upcoming months going into summer. I tell you, as a former person who was in the military during the Cold War, who has studied Russian and or Soviet doctrine, what we're seeing right now is just simply not what you would expect from the Russians. Again, at some point, we are going to see these large maneuver operations by Russian forces, in all probability, in the eastern Donbass, if not someplace else, again, with the Russians possibly opening another front line. But right now, the idea that we will see a Ukrainian counteroffensive, I think, is fairly remote at this point. It could happen. It's possible. Again, the Kharkov operation was definitely a surprise. No one in military circles, and the Ukrainians did a very good job at keeping that operation quiet until it kicked off. But again, right now, it looks like that the Ukrainians just right now simply don't have that capability until all these forces that are currently training in Poland, currently training in Germany, the United Kingdom, and even the United States, thousands of Ukrainian troops are then finish their training in Western Europe, the United States, and then are moved back into Ukraine, formed into strike groups, strike brigades, and then used for offensive operations. Now, we don't know the size of these forces that the Ukrainians are preparing. We do know that we're hearing about small numbers of tanks. In the case of the UK, it's 14 Challenger 2s. That's not a lot of tanks. Probably a few dozen Leopard 2s. We're hearing about the 31 M1A1 Abrams that could be sent or will be sent. And again, that changed as well. Remember, it was M1A2s, newly produced M1A2s that would be sent to Ukraine. Now, because of what's happening on the ground, that timeline has been sped up, and it looks like that the Ukrainians will be receiving M1A1s. And I talked about that in a previous episode, that the tanks are available to hand over to the Ukrainians. The U.S. could hand over tanks almost immediately to the Ukrainians. I don't believe it would take more than a month for the Ukrainian tank crews to become fairly proficient with the Abrams, especially if they were former tankers. I think they could get up to speed and use those tanks fairly quickly. But hasn't happened yet. I am sure we're definitely going to see the first M1, A1, or Leopard, or Challenger that has been destroyed by Russian forces all over Russian media. I think that's going to be a key objective for Russian forces, to display those destroyed Western vehicles, and they are going to be destroyed without a doubt. Not all of them, but again, they're going to take casualties, is what I'm saying. And then finally, heard an interesting tidbit about on the kind of the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainian content provider side, where they were talking about the Ukrainian military doesn't target civilian areas. Well, they have to, and the Russians have to target certain civilian areas as well. These cities are being used in the ongoing war. So if the Russians, or when the Russians take control of Bakhmut, then obviously the Ukrainians are going to shell any Russian forces that are in Bakhmut. There are Ukrainian forces in Sloviansk, and the Russians are attempting to shell and strike at those Ukrainian forces in Sloviansk. So both sides are targeting civilian areas that are being used by military forces. We have seen the Ukrainians as well shell areas such as Donetsk constantly during from 2014 onwards. The Ukrainians launching strikes against targets in Donetsk and other areas, other pro-Russian settlements, was very common. So to say that the Ukrainians don't target civilian areas, I think that's a bit, again, this media narrative that is simply not true. They do, because, well, there may be military targets in those areas. Now, is it to say that they don't also target areas just because they're targeting civilian areas? It's difficult to say. We haven't seen the kind of civilian casualties that would indicate that both militaries are actively trying to kill civilians. You would see a lot more civilian deaths. So in the case of just recent reports where you heard about 20, 30 Ukrainian civilians being wounded and 2 killed, well, if the Russians were intentionally trying to target some of these civilian areas, the casualty rates would be much higher, because they could just saturate some of these cities that are still being inhabited by lots of Ukrainians and lots of pro-Russians on either side, and they could shell these areas very, very heavily. And we just haven't seen the type of civilian casualties that would indicate that both sides are targeting civilians. I think both sides are targeting areas where civilians live, because there are military units in those areas. I mean, again, for defensive purposes, cities, and especially the cities in Ukraine and Russia, these older Soviet-style apartment blocks made out of concrete and again make great defensive redoubts, and they're being used for that. So we'll continue to see these cities getting shelled, such down here as in Volhodar, a smaller town, but again made up of these old-style Soviet apartment blocks that would make it very difficult for the Russian military to maneuver into this city because of the risk of anti-tank guided weapons, snipers, what have you. And that's one of the challenges right now Russia has in taking control of Volhodar. Again, if you look at it on the Google Earth, you will see exactly what I'm talking about, why it's so difficult to seize control of this. And we haven't really seen the carpet bombing or saturation bombing to rubbleize Vuhledar really take place yet. I mean, again, the Russians could just obliterate this town off the map, just erase it. They haven't done it yet. So that ends our video for today. Thank you for joining us. We are continuing to watch things very, very closely. I'll do a real quick speed up of the ongoing situation. Actually, I can't do it on this one. My apologies. It's to do that on the deep state map, and I'm not going to pull that up. But again, we'll continue to watch things very, very closely on the ground. Again, watching Bakhmut, watching Avdiivka, and then also watching areas near Seversk as well. Thank you for joining us today. Have a good day.